If you have ever stepped inside a truly ancient building, tilted your head toward the soaring ceilings, and felt a sudden, visceral certainty that it was never constructed to accommodate our meager human dimensions, comment "I have." If you have never paid attention to this creeping sensation, comment "I haven't." Whatever your answer may be, the 1884 case you are about to hear will force you to brutally re-examine the entirety of our recorded history. The year was 1884. Winter in Pittsburgh was not merely a meteorological condition, it was a living, breathing entity. It carried the bitter, metallic tang of industrial soot, the rancid reek of coal slag, and a bone-deep frost that seeped directly into the marrow from the monolithic stone walls of the Allegheny County Jail. This place was not engineered to merely confine, it was built to devour men whole. Throughout the claustrophobic corridors, the sickly, pallid light from the gas lamps cast elongated shadows against the damp, weeping stones, cultivating a viscous, suffocating atmosphere that felt entirely severed from the world of the living. Samuel Whitmore loathed the cold, yet he desperately required the hollow tranquility of this purgatory. Whitmore was not a born jailer. He was a drifting phantom, a hollowed-out remnant spat back from the Civil War. The blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg had permanently stripped him of the capacity to experience peace. The concussive shatter of cannon fire still ruptured his eardrums in the dead of night, and the phantom stench of limbs hastily sawed off in canvas medical tents had taken permanent root in the man's psyche. Whitmore sought employment at Allegheny for one singular reason. Here he did not have to think. A penitentiary operates on a cold, merciless, and precise logic. Lock the doors, slide the food trays, count the bodies, end the shift. It was a sprawling machine where every human being was nothing more than a mute, grinding cog. That soulless, rhythmic repetition was the only sedative keeping Whitmore's mind from entirely fracturing. But then he was reassigned to Cell Block 7, and the ordered, regimented world he clung to began to violently unravel. The sector known as Cell Block 7 was buried deep within the terminal basement of the West Wing. To descend into its depths, one had to navigate a spiral staircase of rusted iron where the ambient temperature always plummeted several degrees below the rest of the facility. In stark contrast to the cacophony of curses, the pathetic whimpering or the desperate rattling of tin cups against iron bars on the upper tiers, Cell Block 7 was submerged in an unnerving, bewildering silence. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, pulled taut as a garrote wire. The other guards, brawny, callous brutes, who would fracture the skulls of the most violent death row inmates without a twitch of the eye, flatly refused to step foot in this lower sector. If coerced by duty, they would scurry down the steps with frantic haste, use the toe of their boots to shove the tin food tray through the narrow gap beneath the steel door, and scramble back up the stairs as if fleeing an invisible contagion. They were not afraid of violence. The man incarcerated down there had never so much as raised a hand in anger. He had never raised his voice. He was pitiable in his harmlessness. The thing that made those hardened guards shudder, the thing that twisted their guts into knots every time they stood before the iron door of number 7, was a terror of a purely existential nature. It was an overwhelming plunge into the uncanny valley. The very existence of the biological entity inside that room trampled upon every physical and biological law they had ever been indoctrinated to believe. To look upon him was to trigger a primal alarm in the human brain, a screeching warning that this world was a fabricated stage play, and the reality they inhabited could be torn asunder at any given moment. Whitmore did not run. It was not born of bravery, but rather because the devastation within his own soul had reached a threshold where there was simply nothing left to fear. The very first time he gripped the freezing iron key ring and stepped before the threshold of Cell 7, Whitmore immediately noticed a grotesque anomaly in the architecture. The stone archway above the iron doorframe had been violently smashed away. The jagged, hasty chisel marks remained exposed, bleeding gray mortar like an open wound. The original door had been ripped from its hinges, replaced by a massive, oversized slab of raw steel, welded haphazardly to a wall that was never engineered to bear such an immense, crushing weight. Inside, the cell, already a suffocatingly narrow tomb, had been rendered paralyzingly claustrophobic. And then he laid eyes upon the prisoner. The name on his intake ledger was John Robertson. The charge: vagrancy and disorderly conduct. Just dry, neat lines of black ink on a bureaucratic manifest. Yet the gargantuan entity huddled in the pitch-black corner of that cell rendered his criminal record a sick, macabre joke. Robertson stood 9 feet 4 inches tall. His weight was estimated at 460 pounds. Whitmore stood rooted to the stone floor, paralyzed. The flickering oil lamp from the corridor bled into the room, casting the prisoner's shadow against the masonry like a dying, heaving mountain of flesh and bone. The spatial geometry of the cell was not meant for habitation. It was a physical vice designed to systematically crush his colossal frame. The ceilings at Allegheny stood at exactly 9 feet. That meant, for 3 agonizing years, Robertson had not once been able to stand entirely upright. The giant's spine was contorted into a deformed, unnatural semicircle, buckling under the unrelenting oppression of the stone blocks resting mere inches above his crown. His shoulders, as broad as heavy timber slabs, were forced to perpetually hunch inward, scraping against the rough-hewn walls until the coarse burlap of his prison uniform had frayed away, revealing patches of raw, inflamed, and calloused skin. His bed consisted of 3 standard-issue prison cots pushed end to end, their joints welded dead. But even then, his impossibly long legs had to remain tightly coiled, his knees jutting upward like twin barren hills in a suffocating landscape. His hands, with fingers the circumference of a grown man's wrist, thick and deeply fissured, were slowly, methodically picking up cold, boiled potatoes from the tin tray. When Robertson brought the food to his mouth, that mammoth hand engulfed the entirety of his lower face, reducing the potato to the visual scale of a peanut. The sheer contrast did not evoke a sense of the absurd. It evoked a profound, bottomless despair. Robertson's breathing was the sound that haunted Whitmore most during those first few weeks. It did not sound human. It was the heavy, strained wheezing of a pair of gargantuan lungs desperately trying to filter meager sustenance from an atmosphere that was far too thin, far too diluted for his colossal anatomy. With every inhalation, that massive chest cavity expanded, pressing against the claustrophobic void of the room, emitting a sickening chorus of popping cartilage and straining ribs, the acoustic byproduct of a body enduring the catastrophic pressure of being perpetually hunched. The air inside the cell was thick, viscous with the sour reek of cold sweat, systemic decay, and the metallic odor of a body slowly consuming itself. Whitmore realized the brutal truth merely days into his observation. Cell Block 7 was not a holding pen, it was a slow-motion execution machine. The vagrancy sentence was nothing more than a laughable smokescreen fabricated by the authorities to legitimize his abduction. Robertson's true crime was infinitely simpler and far more terrifying. He was too tall, too giant, too visible. He was a living, breathing testament of flesh and bone that no orthodox history book could justify, and no ruling government wished to explain. They did not want to hang him in the public square. That would invite unwanted spectacles, incite the curiosity of journalists and those prone to digging up the past. No. The most efficient way to eradicate an anomaly of history was to lock it inside a box entirely inadequate for its dimensions, and allow the confinement, the asphyxiating pressure, to slowly strangle the life out of it. They were weaponizing architecture to murder him. They used the stone walls, the deliberately low ceilings, and the damp, stale air of the basement to compress him, to shrink him down until he was nothing but a withered husk, appropriately sized for a standard-issue pine coffin. On the graveyard shifts, when the pathetic groans of the inmates above had finally succumbed to sleep, Whitmore would drag a wooden stool to the iron bars. He did not kick the tray through the slot like the others. He handed it through the gap, careful not to spill the watery gruel, waiting for that colossal hand to emerge from the darkness and accept it. The first time Robertson spoke, the sudden resonance startled Whitmore so severely he dropped his keys. The sound did not seem to originate from a vocal cord, but rather vibrated from the cavernous depths of the prisoner's chest, sending a low-frequency shock wave that reverberated off the weeping stones. The voice was deep, languid, carrying the desolate stillness of ancient, crumbling mountains. "Are they not coming down here anymore?" Robertson asked, his deeply sunken eyes, shadowed beneath a heavy, protruding brow ridge, staring out into the pitch-black corridor. "It is only me," Whitmore replied, his voice a raspy whisper. He pulled out a rough-rolled cigarette and struck a match. The flare illuminated Robertson's eyes for a fleeting fraction of a second. They were not the manic, feral eyes of a caged beast. They were the eyes of a melancholic sage, mourning a dying world, eyes harboring an intellect that vastly eclipsed the small men who kept him in chains. The coarse burlap uniform hung loosely over Robertson's frame now. He was hemorrhaging body mass at a terrifying velocity. The garment had to the whispers. Whitmore had been custom-tailored by the outskirts of the city. A man paid an exorbitant sum of state money simply to keep his mouth permanently shut regarding the measurements he had to cut. 9 feet 4 inches, a chest circumference that shattered every conventional measuring tape. This ceiling. Robertson slowly tilted his head upward, his crown hovering mere centimeters from the freezing granite, his brittle, sweat-matted hair clinging to his scalp. "It is crushing my lungs, Samuel. I can feel my ribs piercing my own organs. This world is entirely too small for me, in every conceivable sense." Whitmore took a long, agonizing drag of his cigarette, feeling the bitter, acrid smoke slide down into his own lungs. He stared at the giant curled in the lightless corner, watched his colossal shadow consume half the masonry, and a creeping chill, one entirely unrelated to the ambient temperature, slithered down his spine. He had a sudden, terrifying epiphany. Robertson was not a mutant. He was not the tragic victim of a hyperactive pituitary gland, despite the incessant muttering of the prison physician. The absolute, flawless symmetry of his bone structure, the mechanical grace of his joints, even as they decayed in the cramped void, and the perfectly proportioned skull, all pointed to a single horrifying conclusion. Robertson was not a biological error. He was not an anomaly of nature. Robertson was a normal man, healthy, perfect. It was the world outside, the world of small, fragile men standing barely 6 feet tall like Whitmore, the world of low-slung, squat buildings and ash-choked, polluted skies, that was the true aberration. The decay unfolding inside Cell Block 7 was not the isolated death of a single individual. It was the final, agonizing death rattle of a magnificent species that had once held dominion over the earth, now being slowly, methodically asphyxiated by cunning, late-born scavengers. And over the course of the next 3 years, locked within that suffocating void reeking of mold and oxidized iron, the shadows became the sole witness to a dying confession that would systematically obliterate Samuel Whitmore's entire perception of the past and the colossal cage in which all of humanity was currently imprisoned, blissfully unaware. That cage was not forged of iron or steel, but of a mechanism infinitely more cruel and insidious. And during those endless winter nights thick with the damp subterranean chill, through Robertson's blood-flecked, hacking coughs, Whitmore began to perceive its true, terrifying architecture. On a bleak February night, when the biting frost froze the condensation, soliding the vaulted ceiling of Cell 7, Robertson began to recount the beginning of the end. There was no theatrical thunderclap, no manufactured melodrama. The narrative that rumbled from that decaying behemoth of a chest was merely a continuous grinding murmur, akin to tectonic plates scraping against one another deep beneath the Earth's crust. "They teach you that civilization is an arrow, flying straight and true into the future," Robertson whispered, his fragmented breaths rasping like coarse sandpaper against rotting wood. His massive hand gripped the edge of the iron cot, the knuckles turning a ghastly white from the sheer agony. "But in truth, we are merely scavengers, crawling over the skeletal remains of a far greater world, and we have been programmed to take pride in our scavenging." The cataclysm, as passed down by the generations before Robertson, occurred in the early 1800s. The orthodox history books of the small men, if they dared to mention it at all, typically reduced it to a scattering of localized earthquakes or regional floods. But Robertson's parents called it the reset. It did not strike overnight, allowing humanity the luxury of romanticizing it into a poetic tragedy. It was a prolonged, excruciating torture of the planet itself. First came the seismic waves. They did not violently rupture the earth in sudden jolts. Instead, they undulated and surged like colossal oceanic swells rolling beneath the earth's crust. The ground did not merely crack, it liquefied. Whitmore sat paralyzed on his stool, realizing his cigarette had burned out between his fingers as Robertson vividly described the stench of sulfur and putrid mud erupting from every crevice of the metropolitan centers. Then came the mud, not from overflowing rivers but surging up from the bedrock itself, cascading down from the hillsides like a cold, gray, viscous lava. The mud flood, this deluge of terrestrial sludge, swallowed the sweeping, seamless white stone avenues whole. The dense mud rose higher and higher, infiltrating majestic halls with 20-foot ceilings, drowning colossal colonnades in darkness. Have you ever walked the pavements of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, or New York? Samuel. Robertson's gaze drilled straight into Whitmore through the murky gloom. Have you ever noticed those ground-floor windows that barely peek above the street level? Those staircases leading down into dark, damp basements, possessing an architectural refinement far too intricate for a mere coal cellar? Those are not basements. Those were the ground floors. Those towering, magnificent doors were buried alive in hardened mud. Your world is built directly upon the rooftops of ours. Whitmore shuddered violently. The air in the cells seemed to thicken, turning into an unbreathable patois. His mind flashed to the construction sites he had passed on his patrols, where the pickaxes of laborers struck against impossibly massive foundation stones buried deep, too colossal, too perfectly hewn to make any logical sense beneath the cheap, fired brick tenements being erected on top of them. Yet the physical devastation was merely the prologue. The true apocalypse, the mechanism actively murdering Robertson in this very room, was a global biological purge. This atmosphere. Robertson took a laborious, ragged breath, his vast ribcage expanding and collapsing in an agonizing display of futility. It is already dead. In the old world, the world preceding the reset, the atmosphere was not this pale, toxic vapor. The air was denser, possessing a different chromatic resonance, heavily charged with invisible currents of static energy that the giant physiology absorbed directly as sustenance. It was an ecosystem of flawless symbiosis. That primordial atmosphere nurtured their colossal frames, granting them centuries of life and the ability to spontaneously regenerate tissue without the need for the bitter tinctures or rusted surgical blades of the New World. At the heart of those monolithic white-stone metropolises stood the towering energy spires. They were not monuments of vanity. They were colossal machines designed to harvest ether-free, atmospheric energy. The polished copper domes crowning their peaks drew down the celestial charge, funneling it into subterranean channels, illuminating the cities with a cold, soothing, and regenerative light. But following the seismic mud floods, the atmosphere fractured, the invisible currents of ether bled out. The sky faded into a sickly, melancholic pallor. That is when your species ascended, Robertson smiled faintly, a smile devoid of malice, harboring only a bottomless, bitter sorrow. Because you are small, you require less oxygen, less energy. You are akin to the rodents that emerge from the ashes after the great ancient forests have burned to the ground. The decay of the atmosphere was the perfect incubator for your evolution. As for us, we began to asphyxiate on our own planet. The chill radiating from the stone walls breathed directly onto the nape of Whitmore's neck. He felt his stomach violently contort. That ruthless logic utterly dismantled every ounce of human arrogance he had ever been taught. Modern man was not the pinnacle of biological superiority. They were merely opportunists, biological remnants that managed to adapt to the rotting carcass of the earth. And then, as the framework of the New World was erected, the Great Purge commenced. The weaker yet far more numerous species, orchestrated by a faceless, deeply cunning elite, initiated the systematic rewriting of reality. For the new paradigm to be accepted, all physical evidence of a superior past had to be eradicated, and the surviving giants were the most undeniable, breathing pieces of evidence. Robertson was born in 1831, right in the smoldering aftermath of that transition. With a voice rattling through a throat thick with bloody phlegm, he told Whitmore of a childhood steeped in pure psychological terror, hidden away in lightless cellars across rural Pennsylvania. Rather than basking in the sunlight, Robertson was concealed like a grotesque crime. To mask his anomaly, his parents, surviving titans harboring the intellect of the old world, were forced to physically torture their own son. Whitmore squeezed his eyes shut as Robertson detailed the sensation of coarse burlap straps being brutally cinched around his torso from infancy. Bound so tightly his ribcage could not expand, crushing his heart and lungs to manually stunt the explosive growth of his anatomy, rations were slashed to the threshold of sheer starvation. Every night, in a root cellar reeking of mildew and damp loam, the boy Robertson lay curled in a fetal position, biting through his own lips to suppress his screams as his bones lengthened, desperate to stretch, only to be crushed backward by the rigid bindings and the claustrophobia of his confinement. It was premeditated mutilation, a desperate attempt to force a god to wear the skin of an ordinary man, but biology could not be suppressed indefinitely. The genetic inheritance of a magnificent race could not be starved into submission. When Robertson breached the 8-foot mark, he could no longer step into the daylight. "They did not march into our homes with rifles to gun us down," Robertson said softly, his colossal finger tracing the rough, freezing iron of the bars. "Executing us in the streets is the tactic of inferior minds. The architects of the New World were infinitely more sophisticated. They targeted the human psyche. They gathered people like me." Whitmore shuddered, a sudden memory surfacing of the lurid, sensational posters plastered across Pittsburgh's brick walls whenever a traveling circus rolled into town. The mutated giant, the world's tallest monster, nature's grotesque blunder. "Exactly," Robertson murmured, as if reading the guard's mind. "They threw us into freak shows or locked us in insane asylums." "Samuel, do you grasp the sadistic brill behind that strategy? If they butchered us in the town square, the public would ask who we were. But if they forced us into garish clown suits, chained us in animal enclosures, and made us a theatrical spectacle for the tiny masses, then the majesty of the past is instantaneously degraded into a biological punchline. You look at us and feel revulsion or perhaps pity. You thump your chests, utterly convinced that your diminutive species is the gold standard of perfection, and that we are merely the genetic garbage of evolution." The words crashed down like heavy stones upon Whitmore's consciousness. The asylums and the circuses, they were not institutions for entertainment or medical care. They were slaughterhouses of human dignity, industrial-scale centers of mass psychological conditioning. By transforming the living relics of a superior civilization into freaks, the ruling elite had successfully locked the collective human mind inside a microscopic paradigm. They stripped humanity of the pride of looking up, conditioning them instead to keep their heads bowed, toiling away as slaves to the coal-fired machines belching black soot into the sky. The temperature inside the cells seemed to plunge below freezing, the stench of putrefaction, mingling with an absolutely paralyzing sense of dread, entirely flooded Whitmore's lungs. Robertson's cough erupted again, this time violently prolonged, sending dark, coagulated clots of blood splattering across the freezing flagstones. That colossal body was literally shattering from the inside out, not merely from oxygen deprivation, but because the sheer crushing gravity of 1,000 years of denied history was obliterating his nervous system. Whitmore sat frozen, oblivious to the fact that his cigarette had burned down to the very flesh of his fingertips. The searing pain of the ember was nothing compared to the apocalyptic collapse of every belief system currently taking place in his mind. In the cramped, pitch-black and asphyxiating confines of Cell Block 7, Whitmore came to a horrifying realization. He, too, was an inmate. The only difference was that Robertson knew precisely the dimensions of the stone walls that confined him, while Whitmore, alongside millions of others walking the streets above, was gleefully dancing inside an invisible cage, utterly convinced it was the entire universe. The ultimate cruelty of that invisible cage was that humanity willingly stepped inside and engaged the deadbolt from within. The dead silence of Cell Block 7 was no longer the sanctuary Whitmore had once craved. It had become the morbid stillness of a coffin lid slowly sliding into place. The acrid stench of gray cigarette smoke coiled around the metallic reek of blood seeping from the giant's teeth, brewing a cocktail of absolute, suffocating terror. In that dim, viscous gloom, Whitmore's psyche was being stretched to its absolute limits, splintering under the weight of a truth so macrocosmic it bordered on the absurd. "Did you think they locked me down here because they feared I would speak?" Robertson cleared his throat, a wet, agonizing rattle. The sound careened off the freezing stone, mimicking the crack of rotting timber yielding to pressure. No, they know that even if I screamed it from the center of the public square, no one would believe a word. But there are entities that do not need a voice. Their mere physical presence is enough to unravel the entire theatrical production, and when they can no longer be hidden, the architects will orchestrate their eradication in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The gargantuan prisoner shifted his weight. His massive shadow slithered along the wall, catching on the jagged chisel marks. The ambient frost radiating from the granite blocks seemed to be vampirically draining his remaining body heat, yet those deeply sunken eyes burned with a piercing, melancholic intensity. "The year is 1884, Samuel," Robertson stated methodically, every syllable a Herculean effort as his massive chest fought against the spatial oppression of the low ceiling. "I want you to burn this date into your memory, because I am going to tell you exactly what they are preparing to do. 9 years from now, you will witness a miracle erupt from the earth in Chicago, then Buffalo, then St. Louis. They will label them World's Fairs. But do not let the sweeping symphonies and the blinding incandescent lights deceive you. Those are not festivals, they are erasure events." Whitmore furrowed his brow, a sharp, piercing ache throbbing in his temples. He ground the heel of his boot into the damp dust of the flagstones, desperately clutching at the last shreds of conventional logic. A fair? A festival? How could such things serve as instruments of historical annihilation? As if reading the chaotic panic in the little guard's mind, Robertson offered an exhausted, blood-stained smile. His chapped lips split, oozing dark crimson. "Think it through, Samuel. You are a sculptor, and you demand the world believe your pathetic amateurish clay pot is the greatest masterpiece ever conceived. What do you do if right next to it stands a flawless monolithic palace erected by the gods themselves? Do you dynamite it under the cover of darkness? No. People will ask questions. Human curiosity is dangerous. Instead, you throw an opulent, blindingly massive party right inside that very palace. You declare to the world that you just built it yourself, constructed entirely of cheap timber and plaster, intended solely for a fleeting season of revelry. You parade millions of people through its gates, let them stand in awe, let them sing your praises, and then, with total, unchallenged authority, you set it ablaze. You tear it all down to the foundations, justifying the destruction by claiming it was always meant to be temporary. And just like that, the palace is wiped from physical reality and simultaneously scrubbed from human consciousness. You have successfully counterfeited their memory." Whitmore's breath caught in his throat. The subterranean chill of the basement rapidly mutated into the icy paralysis of absolute realization. It shrieked through his neural pathways. Robertson began detailing an impending World's Fair in Chicago set for 1893, 9 years into the unwritten future, with a terrifying surgical precision that made the blood in Whitmore's veins run cold. He described a colossal white city, featuring over 200 gargantuan edifices dripping in neoclassical majesty. He spoke of colonnades soaring dozens of meters into the smoggy sky, of gargantuan domes, intricately carved down to the millimeter, sprawling across an expanse exceeding 600 acres. They will tell you that all those structures, hundreds of megalithic architectural leviathans, were erected in less than 2 years. Robertson's voice echoed like a restless phantom delivering the eulogy at his own funeral. And the material? They will brainwash the public with a flawless, deceptive lie. Staff, a cheap, ephemeral slurry of plaster, hemp fiber, and cement. They will convince you that those breathtaking palaces are nothing but temporary husks, hastily assembled to showcase the industrial might of the American empire. Robertson leaned forward, his massive hands wrapping around the freezing iron bars with such crushing force that Whitmore could hear the metal groan in protest. But use the tactical mind of a soldier, Samuel. The criminal brilliance of this lie lies in its sheer, incomprehensible scale. It is too massive to be questioned. Would you forge a gargantuan palace of solid marble and structural steel, sculpt thousands of intricate statues, and perfect an entire grid of canals, roads, and flawless drainage systems, only to host a 6-month party and then smash it into dust? Would you mobilize an army of tens of thousands of laborers to cast a fully functioning metropolis, vastly more magnificent than any contemporary European capital, only to sweep it away like a pile of common refuse. Who invests that volume of resources and human intellect into a disposable commodity? Absolutely no one, unless that city was already there, left over from an epoch buried deeply in the past. Whitmore swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He tasted the metallic tang of blood and pulverized dirt. The imagery Robertson conjured materialized in his brain with horrifying clarity. It was gaslighting executed on a planetary scale. The elites were not constructing the White City. They had discovered it. They were excavating it from the hardened sludge of the Great Reset. They were merely slathering a thin veneer of plaster over the ancient megalithic stones, painting them a blinding white, screwing in a few modern electric bulbs, and proudly claiming the triumph as their own. They would open the gates for millions of working-class Americans, people who spent their lives rotting in cramped, foul-smelling brick tenements choked by coal smoke, to enter and marvel. That diminutive, ignorant flock would stare up at the 60-foot vaulted ceilings, with eyes full of religious reverence, weeping at the evolution of mankind, entirely ignorant of the fact that they were strolling through a graveyard of gods. They were clapping their hands raw at the scene of the greatest heritage theft in human history. And when the fair concluded, when the collective psyche of millions had permanently registered the lie that these buildings are just temporary plaster constructs, the ruling class would mercilessly bring in the dynamite and the wrecking cranes. They would pulverize the lot. They would flatten the primordial architecture of the old world, turning it into airborne ash right before the public's eyes. And the public would nod their heads, accepting it as a logical, necessary course of action. It is not prophecy, Samuel, it is a cycle. The standard operating procedure of a serial killer, Robertson hacked, a wet, agonizing spasm echoing from his compressed lungs. He rested his forehead against his protruding knees. I witnessed the procedure begin with my own eyes in Philadelphia in 1876. The temperature in the cell seemed to plunge another degree. Whitmore violently shivered, pulling the collar of his wool coat tight against his neck. 1876. The Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. That was the brief, fleeting window when Robertson had attempted to live quietly off the grid before his inevitable capture. I was hiding in the derelict warehouses near the perimeter of Fairmount Park, Robertson whispered, his voice thick with a paralyzing, impotent rage. They cordoned off massive tracts of land with towering wooden fences. They fed the newspapers the story that they were digging foundations for the new exhibition halls. But Samuel, I stood taller than those fences. Standing in the darkness, from a distance, I saw exactly what they were doing. The giant paused, his fragmented breathing sounding like the rustling of brittle, decayed pages in a ledger of the dead. They were not digging foundations. They were unearthing. Hundreds of men drenched in sweat, using pickaxes and shovels to scrape away thousands of tons of petrified mud from deep within the earth. And beneath that sediment were megalithic stones, monolithic stone terraces stretching for dozens of meters, the bases of columns as thick as ancient oak trees, lying there in silence since before this country was even given a name. They had been buried following the mud deluge I told you about. They hauled the mud away, pressure-washed the stone, haphazardly stacked a few levels of cheap-fired brick on top of that divine foundation, cut a ribbon, and declared it a new construction. Whitmore clutched his head, his fingernails digging fiercely into his scalp, slick with cold sweat. The fragmented news clippings he had skimmed in the local Pittsburgh and Philadelphia dailies suddenly violently snapped together, forming a macabre mosaic in his mind. The excavation reports from the municipal engineering crews. Laborers documenting how they had to dig through profound depths of dense sludge only to strike the ruined foundations of the ancients. Yet the official government mandates subsequently redacted that exact phrase entirely, replacing it with the sterile term site preparation. Whitmore recalled the earliest grainy photographs of the Philadelphia exhibition grounds before opening day, the ones he had casually glanced at in a smoky tavern. In the blurred background of those images stood colossal structures, boasting entirely alien geometries, soaring towers crowned with metallic onion domes piercing the gray sky. Yet, by the day the gates officially opened, Those structures had vanished like a phantom, leaving absolutely no trace in any of the official souvenir lithographs. They had been aggressively demolished the moment they were fully excavated, simply because their architecture directly contradicted the orthodox narrative the authorities were weaving. The most terrifying aspect is the material. Where did the material vanish to, Samuel? Robertson lifted his head, his bleak, shadowed eyes locking onto Whitmore. Thousands of buildings. Millions of tons of solid granite block, colossal steel frameworks, gargantuan statuary, monolithic Casper domes. When they dismantle them after the fairs, a volume of raw material that astronomical is more than sufficient to entirely rebuild the slums of Chicago or New York. It should have flooded the salvage markets. It should have been auctioned to contractors, but no. Not a single brick, not a solitary slab of marble ever leaked into the public market. It evaporated. It was scrubbed completely from the financial ledgers. A fraction was dumped into the crushing depths of Lake Michigan. The vast majority of the megalithic stone was pulverized into dust or buried right back into the earth, exactly like a murderer dismembering his victim and scattering the pieces far and wide, ensuring no one could ever reassemble the true form of the body. The spatial dimensions of the cell seemed to contract, actively strangling Whitmore's lungs. His chest was choked with a bitter bile. A wave of profound nausea washed over him. It was not provoked by the putrid stench of the penitentiary, but rather by the sheer sickening pathology of the ruling regime he was currently serving. This was not merely the demolition of architecture. This was a calculated psychological offensive designed to permanently sever modern humanity's tether to the majesty of the past by obliterating the remnants of the old civilization Tartaria. The elite had reduced the human race to historical orphans, afflicted with a manufactured, collective amnesia. Humanity was violently coerced into believing that the cramped, squalid, box-like tenements roofed with rusted corrugated iron waiting just outside these walls were the very zenith of civilization. Brainwashed into accepting that the daily struggle, the perpetual starvation, and the back-breaking labor within the coal mines were the ultimate manifestations of evolution. They did not smash the past to pieces because it was obsolete. They pulverized it because it was infinitely more magnificent than the present. A species that had once thrived beneath 60-foot vaulted ceilings, drawing free, boundless energy directly from the heavens, would never docilely scurry into filthy, mechanized textile mills to serve as indentured slaves for the capitalist class. Whitmore's breathing grew shallow and frantic. The flickering gas lamp in the corridor was abruptly snuffed out by a sudden frigid draft sweeping up from the abyssal depths of the stairwell, plunging the entirety of cell block 7 into an impenetrable, pitch-black void. And within that stifling, viscous darkness, the blood-choked, wheezing breath of the last giant resonated like a finalized death sentence. Samuel Whitmore, Hadanda Orat wooden stool, felt, for the very first time in his life, an absolute paralyzing terror of the very earth upon which he stood. Beneath every cobblestone street he traversed each day, beneath every modern edifice currently vomiting black, noxious smoke into the sky, lay thousands of tons of petrified mud, desperately attempting to smother the dying screams of an assassinated, majestic world. The entirety of the United States, the entirety of this world, was nothing more than a colossal crime scene, sterilized and swept clean with terrifying meticulousness. This planetary crime scene was scrubbed so flawlessly that the only remaining leak capable of unmasking their deceit lay buried dozens of feet beneath the black loam, the fractured remnants of bone. Yet, in this colossal terrarium, even death was strictly forbidden from speaking the truth. In the waning years of the 19th century, beneath a dense fog suffocating with the stench of industrial soot, the North American earth was being violently ripped apart by expanding railway lines and newly birthed mining excavations. And from beneath those strata of cold, pungent loam, calcium-bound truths began to claw their way to the surface. The iron shovels of railway laborers in Ohio, the plows of calloused farmers in Pennsylvania, perpetually struck against unyielding masses of matter. It was not bedrock, they were skulls the size of boulders, femurs stretching longer than the entire height of a fully grown modern man. The scent of ancient, damp earth, The odor of centuries-old putrefaction rose into the air, mingling with the horror and feverish excitement of the excavators. The local periodicals of the era immediately printed these bulletins in pitch-black ink that still reeked of petroleum, running massive headlines heralding giants standing 8-9 feet tall. They published accompanying photographs depicting laborers dwarfed, standing diminutive beside a skeletal leviathan. It seemed for a fleeting moment that the truth was poised to shatter the glass walls of this fabricated history. But then, the men in the black tailored suits arrived. They descended from an institution bearing a name drenched in academic prestige and unquestionable authority, the Smithsonian Institution. They did not brandish firearms. Instead, they brought iron-banded crates of raw pine, certificates stamped with crimson wax seals reeking of melting tallow, and velvet-tongued promises regarding the preservation of scholarly heritage. The naive farmers, the coarse, uneducated laborers drenched in sour sweat, obediently surrendered these colossal skeletal remains to this organization, operating under the pathetic delusion that their discoveries would be enshrined within the glass displays of grand museums. They could never have known that the rhythmic pounding of the hammers, driving 3-inch steel nails into the lids of those wooden crates, was simultaneously sealing the coffin lid on the truth itself. The Smithsonian was not a sanctuary for history. Its true function within this ecosystem of deceit was to serve as an incinerator of human memory. Hundreds, thousands of colossal skeletal remains were shipped into the pitch-black, cavernous sub-basements of the institution, and then they simply evaporated, vanished without a single residual trace. When the public and the press dared to begin asking questions, the only response they received was a chorus of cold, synchronized head shakes. What skeletons? The newspapers exaggerated. Those ignorant farmers merely mistook the bones of giant reptiles for human remains. This systemic institutional denial was executed with a smoothness that was utterly terrifying, a meticulous sterilization protocol designed to purge the ashes of the past. And that exact, identical protocol was unfolding right before Samuel Whitmore's eyes, locked inside the suffocating, rancid confines of March of 1884. Winter was exhaling its final, freezing breaths down into the sub-basement of Allegheny County Jail. The atmosphere inside the cell had congealed into a viscous slime, tainted with the horrific copper stench of pooling blood, sour sweat, and necrotic organ failure. That night, the stillness was so absolute that Whitmore could hear the furious, rhythmic thumping of the veins pulsing against his own temples. Then a wet, guttural gurgle ruptured the quiet. It sounded like thick mud boiling at the bottom of a stagnant lake. Whitmore flinched, dropping his cigarette. He lunged toward the iron bars. Inside the lightless corner, the mammoth shadow of John Robertson was violently collapsing onto the freezing granite floor. A heavy, sickening thud echoed against the masonry, sending a tremor through the rusted iron grills. Robertson was seizing. His two hands, the size of dinner plates, clawed furiously at the cobblestone floor until his fingernails tore, bleeding onto the stone. His colossal ribcage arched upward, desperately trying to wring a single gasp of oxygen from the sulfur-tainted air of the basement, but it was entirely futile. The sickening pop of bursting air bubbles rattled deep within his bronchial tubes, accompanied by thick, coagulated streams of black blood that surged from the corners of his cracked lips, spilling down his jawline, saturating the frayed, ruined burlap of his prison uniform. "Guards, get the physician! Hurry!" Whitmore roared, his voice cracking into a ragged scream as he frantically rattled the heavy steel door. The iron keyring clattered and shrieked against the bars, the metallic cacophony ricocheting down the shadowy corridor. But the only answer he received was silence, the deafening, calculated silence of the system. A duty warden eventually strolled down the staircase, his facial expression bearing a terrifying, apathetic void. He casually glanced at the gigantic physique writhing in a pool of dark blood, then stated with chilling nonchalance, "The doctor is occupied. He will be down later." That supposed occupation stretched for 4 agonizing hours, 4 hours, 240 minutes. Every single tick of the second hand on the brass pocket watch resting in Whitmore's vest struck his auditory nerves like the fatal blow of a blacksmith's hammer. Whitmore slumped down onto the freezing stone floor right beside the bars, sliding his hand through the gap to tightly grip Robertson's rough, ice-cold fingers, which were already beginning to lock into rigor mortis. The overwhelming, metallic stench of fresh blood assaulted Whitmore's sinuses, inducing waves of nausea, yet he dared not withdraw his hand. Throughout those 4 hours of psychological torment, Whitmore bitterly comprehended a ruthless truth of forensic pathology. Sometimes, the most flawless murder weapon is not a serrated blade or a lead bullet. The most flawless weapon is calculated delay. They had no need to dispatch an assassin into the basement. They merely had to engage the locks and allow the spatial confinement, the asphyxiation, and the slow march of time to methodically drain the lifeblood from this living piece of evidence. The prison doctor was not occupied. He was sitting in his heated, comfortable office on the upper floor, leisurely sipping a hot cup of tea, patiently waiting for the entity belonging to the old world to completely, irreversibly expire. By the time the physician descended the stairwell, his leather medical bag in hand, the hard soles of his boots clicking out a dry rhythm, Robertson had ceased his seizing. The giant's profoundly deep eyes had clouded over into an opaque, milky gray, staring sightlessly up at the vaulted stone ceiling, the very cage that had imprisoned not merely his physical form, but the entire history of his kin. The doctor fastened a cloth mask over his face and reluctantly stepped into the cell, walking on his toes to avoid the pooling black blood. He did not even bother to check for a pulse. He simply withdrew a leather-bound notebook, his fountain pen scratching harshly against the parchment, generating a sound that made the skin crawl. Pulmonary tuberculosis, complications resulting from gigantism. The doctor's voice was a flat, soulless monotone, as frigid as the midnight frost. A death by natural causes. There is no need to open an inquiry. Natural? Whitmore bellowed, lunging forward to seize the physician by the collar, his breath exhaling in white plumes of absolute, unadulterated fury. Are you blind? This room murdered him. You murdered him by shoving him into a box smaller than his own anatomy. The doctor merely batted Whitmore's hands away with an icy detachment, casually brushing the wrinkles from his lapel. He gazed down his nose at the guard, his eyes glinting with the condescending arrogance unique to those who hold true, systemic power. Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise you to shut your mouth and return to your assigned duties, unless of course you wish to share in an equally natural cause of death such as this. That very afternoon, John Robertson's corpse was extracted. There was no hearse, no somber procession. A horse-drawn wagon draped in heavy black canvas, completely devoid of any state or municipal insignia, quietly parked at the side entrance of the penitentiary. 4 men shrouded in heavy gray overcoats, reeking so violently of formaldehyde preservatives that it stung the nostrils of anyone nearby, dragged the colossal body, now tightly bound in 3 layers of coarse sailcloth, and violently hurled it onto the flatbed. The sickening, staccato crack of the corpse's ribs, snapping under the brute force of the impact, was enough to make the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. Later, through the hushed, drunken whispers exchanged in the subterranean taverns frequented by gravediggers and morticians, Whitmore finally learned the true destination of that wagon. It was not a cemetery. The cadaver was transported directly to an isolated, privately funded medical college in Philadelphia. Within those walls, the cold steel of surgical bone saws dismembered that magnificent physique. They dissected him, they measured him, and they submerged his bones into vats of diluted acid to obliterate absolutely every biological trace of his existence. Every single document verifying John Robertson's tenure in the prison, the intake receipts, the ration logs, the death certificate, was instantaneously stamped with a top-secret classification. The gag order restricting access to those files spanned a full century, a duration perfectly calculated to ensure that every living soul who knew of his existence would rot down to dust and ash. Yet, the inherent nature of a deceptive regime is that it must perpetually recycle its own crimes, for a past so immense and grand cannot be entirely buried overnight. The cycle of the bone thieves did not terminate in the 19th century, and now let us pull the timeline taut, parting from the moldering shadows of 1884 to step directly into the suffocating grip of the modern era. The year 2003, A dusty, wind-whipped October afternoon at an urban demolition site in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh. The deafening roar of diesel-powered excavators tore at the eardrums, while the desiccated stench of cement dust violently mingled with the acrid reek of steel being severed by acetylene torches, conjuring a blinding, opaque smog. The gargantuan steel bucket of the excavator plunged deep into the soil, intending to rip out the final bedrock foundation. But instead of striking dirt, a piercing, metallic clang shrieked through the air, sending violent vibrations shooting up the steering column into the operator's hands. The steel teeth had just ripped open a solid lead vault buried deep beneath the subterranean strata. When the crew of laborers trained their flashlights down into the gaping, pitch-black chasm they had just created, an icy gust of air, thick with the century-old stench of surgical alcohol and formaldehyde, struck them directly in the face. The subterranean chamber was bone-dry, lined with pristine white ceramic tiles that had severely yellowed with age, and inside that vault, illuminated by the feeble beams of their halogen torches, lay a literal treasury of horror. Dozens of colossal cylindrical glass specimen jars, rising chest-high, were aligned meticulously across stainless steel shelving. Floating suspended within a murky pale yellow preservative fluid were biological specimens of utterly absurd, impossible dimensions. A human heart the size of a rugby ball, thick polished segments of femurs so grotesquely elongated they could never fit inside a modern human incubator, and the skulls. Partially fractured craniums boasting cavernous sockets, flaring jawbones, skulls easily twice the circumference of a standard bald adult American male. Hushed whispers of sheer panic began to infect the construction site. The foreman immediately grabbed his radio to dispatch a call to the local police department. But the police never arrived. Less than 40 minutes following the discovery, 4 sleek, unmarked black SUVs screeched to a halt at the perimeter gates, violently churning up the gravel. Men clad in stark black suits and dark sunglasses disembarked, their faces as devoid of emotion as waxen effigies. They did not state their names, they flashed no federal badges. They moved with a chilling, predatory silence and precision that made the skin crawl. The entire demolition crew was aggressively herded into a corner, pressed against the chain-link fencing, flanked by the distinct silhouettes of submachine guns concealed beneath dark trench coats. The biting odor of chemical disinfectants was immediately aerosolized, creating a white mist over the entire site. Fully tarped military transport trucks reversed directly up to the lip of the excavated vault. One by one, the gargantuan glass jars and anomalous bone fragments were loaded into the vehicles in an atmosphere of absolute terrifying silence. The trembling foreman was handed a 6-figure compensation check by the lead operative, accompanied by a pre-printed, non-disclosure agreement bearing the phrase "hazardous biomedical waste resulting from illegal early 1900s experimentation. Severe risk of pathogenic contamination. Take the funds to cover your operational delays, and permanently forget that you ever dug up a pile of hospital garbage." The agent hissed, his tone flat, devoid of a single inflection of humanity, as freezing as a straight razor dragging across the jugular. And just like that, the scene was wiped immaculately clean. Not a single blurb appeared in the local papers, not a single police incident report was filed. All that remained was the faint, lingering trace of medical alcohol dissolved in the polluted skies of Pittsburgh, and the paralyzing dread of working-class men who had suddenly, violently awakened to the omnipotent power of the cover-up. It is a ruthless, endless hunt between the architects of the cover-up and the fragile, independent researchers desperately attempting to stitch history back together. Today, within claustrophobic archives choking on the smell of decaying paper and mold spores, those who starve for the truth persistently file thousands of requests under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. They knock on the doors of state depositories and the Smithsonian, hunting for the 1884 Allegheny prison logs, scouring for the late 19th century medical reports from those private universities. And what do they receive in the mail for their efforts? Standard sheets of paper reeking of pungent, tar-like printer ink. A jagged, violent black ink that brutally slashes vertically and horizontally, suffocating every sentence, every name, every date. It is an ocean of pitch-black redaction ribbons, devouring every identity, every recorded dimension, every shred of existence. Staring down at those completely blacked-out documents, one does not see innocence. One sees the silhouette of a colossal phantom power sitting in the darkness, cannibalizing the human past with the jagged teeth of censorship. These researchers believe they are hunting ghosts, entirely unaware that this rotting system is tracking them in return, staring back through the dead silence of those black-inked pages. Those silent ribbons of black redaction ink smeared across the suppressed reports are, in a cruel twist of irony, the exact same shade of ink that Samuel Whitmore bled the remainder of his life into, pouring his soul onto yellowing parchment. 6 months after the night Robertson exhaled his final breath, Whitmore tendered his resignation. He walked away from Allegheny County Jail on a slate-gray morning, the dense fog rolling off the Ohio River, swallowing the galvanized tin roofs of the factories whole. He tread upon the cobblestone street, yet every footfall, striking the earth, carried a bizarre, hollow reverberation. Whitmore felt as though the crushed gravel beneath his boot soles was nothing more than a fragile eggshell, threatening to shatter at any moment and plunge him into the gaping abyss of a buried world below. The penitentiary was left behind, but Cell Block 7 never relinquished its grip on him. It took permanent root in his olfactory senses. No matter how rigorously Whitmore scrubbed his skin with harsh lye soap, no matter how much cheap cologne he doused himself in, the metallic scent of rusted iron bars, the mildew of weeping stone, and the horrific, coppery stench of the giant's blood perpetually haunted his sinuses. It was the distinct, unmistakable aroma of rotting truth. Whitmore returned to his family, only to unearth a tragedy far more merciless than death itself: the absolute isolation of an awakened mind trapped within a flock of sleepwalkers. During evening suppers, cast in the dim, flickering glow of mantel lamps, Whitmore sat mute at the head of the table, watching his wife and children animatedly discuss the trivialities of their fabricated reality. They spoke of a newly inaugurated railway line, sang praises to the raw power of the steam engine, and beamed with pride over the towering factory smokestacks belching pillars of soot that blotted out the sun. They hailed it as the great ascension of America. They believed it with a pathetic, primordial, and utterly naive conviction. Whitmore stared at those joyous, miniature faces, and his stomach contorted in violent waves of nausea. He wanted to scream, to smash the porcelain plates across the table and roar into their faces. "It is all garbage. Your railways are running atop the rooftops of gods. Those smokestacks you worship are merely rusted toys compared to the eternal spires that siphoned electricity directly from the heavens, spires they deliberately pulverized." But he could not speak. Or rather, whenever he attempted to pry open the door to the truth, the only reward he reaped was a barrage of alienated, pitying glances, culminating in sheer, abject terror from his own flesh and blood. His wife began to weep softly in the dead of night, murmuring to the local parish reverend that the war had fractured Samuel's mind. His children actively evaded their father's gaze. The outside world, the newspaper editors to whom he mailed his trembling, handwritten manuscripts, responded with a wall of contemptuous silence. No one wanted to listen. No one possessed the courage to believe. The supreme cruelty of an institutionalized brainwashing system does not manifest in silencing dissidents with the barrel of a gun. They are infinitely more sophisticated than that. They architect a simulated reality that is just warm enough, just comfortable enough, that humanity desperately craves to cling to it. When you attempt to shred that velvet curtain of lies, it is your fellow inmates who will violently turn on you, tearing you to pieces to protect the sanctity of their own cage. Collective amnesia is not a disease. It is a psychological defense mechanism. To consciously recognize oneself as an inferior biological organism parasitically clinging to the ruins of a divine, master race is an indignity simply too catastrophic for the human ego to withstand. Therefore, the brain autonomously rejects the truth, exactly how a biological immune system forcibly rejects a mismatched organ transplant. They branded Whitmore a lunatic. And over the passage of time, the humiliation from his kin and the ostracization from his community effectively locked Whitmore inside a second solitary confinement, a cell devoid of iron bars. yet infinitely more suffocating and colder than any subterranean dungeon. He barricaded himself inside a cobweb-draped attic. For 30 grueling years, the singular sound that defined Samuel Whitmore's existence was the harsh, abrasive scratching of a steel-nibbed pen against parchment. He wrote like a man possessed by a fevered, divine wrath, writing until the joints of his fingers swelled, contorted, and bruised a sickly purple from lack of circulation. Robertson's ragged, dying gasps from decades past had now been transmuted into jagged, haunting strokes of calligraphy. He sketched the anatomical structure of the giant's cranium, calculated the density of the masonry walls that had crushed that massive chest, and obsessively chronicled every minute detail regarding the world's fairs, the deluge of mud, and the copper-crowned spires. He harbored no delusion that his contemporaries would ever comprehend his work. He was hurtling these journals into the abysses of the future, a desperate attempt to broadcast an SOS signal into the eternal void. In 1914, Samuel Whitmore perished. His exhausted, withered heart simply refused to beat another rhythm under the crushing gravity of secrets far too immense to carry. His funeral was a hasty, frigid affair. His obituary in the local paper sank into obscurity, wedged somewhere between advertisements and laundry lye. His family silently shoved the thick stacks of moldering, leather-bound journals deep into the belly of an oak trunk, sealed it tight with a rusted padlock, and prayed that the phantom of his insanity would remain permanently interred alongside his corpse. But the truth behaves akin to a highly acidic subterranean aquifer. It invariably finds a way to corrode through its containment. More than 4 decades bled away. In 1956, the dust of history was violently disturbed. Whitmore's great-granddaughter, whilst clearing out the crumbling ancestral estate on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, shattered the rusted lock of that oak trunk. The stench of decaying parchment, mildew, and stagnant air violently erupted, carrying the spectral breath of Cell Block 7 across the chasm of time. The young woman stayed awake for countless nights, shuddering as she turned the pages, densely packed with her great-grandfather's frantic scrawl. The freezing terror of 1884 slithered up her spine. Driven by a bizarre, inherited compulsion, she carried these volumes to the doors of local historical societies and prestigious university professors. The response she garnered was not the naked contempt Whitmore had endured, but rather a sickeningly polite rejection that radiated an aura of lethal danger. The bespectacled scholars, draped in tweed smelling of expensive aftershave, merely smiled as they skimmed a few pages before gently sliding the text back across their mahogany desks. Too controversial. Fundamentally unverifiable, these fragments pose a direct threat to the federally sanctioned framework of historical discourse, my dear. And then the inevitable arrived, the year 1959. There was no sound of shattering glass, no sound of door hinges being violently breached. Waking one morning, the great-granddaughter discovered to her absolute horror that all 30 leather-bound journals resting upon her desk had completely evaporated into thin air. A hollow, freezing void in the dust was all that remained on the wooden surface. The police arrived, scribbled a few pathetic lines into a report with bored expressions, and officially classified it as a theft of personal property, with 0 signs of forced entry. The case file was terminated that very same day. The machine of suppression does not need to kick your front door off its hinges. They are phantoms holding the master keys to every residence in the nation. They had caught the scent of the leak, and they came to meticulously sweep away the final, lingering dregs of history Whitmore had left behind. But they were a fraction of a second too slow. They could not have anticipated that, guided by a severe premonition of dread, the great-granddaughter had already commissioned photocopies of the most critical segments of the journals. Those faded, highly grained, black-and-white reproductions, bearing Whitmore's jagged handwriting, they trickled steadily into the subterranean underground, passed hand to hand among independent researchers. The rogues' scholars, dwelling in the darkest corners of message boards, vehemently refusing to consume the salt, pasteurized history, force-fed to them by the ruling elite. Those surviving fragments meticulously documented every dying syllable uttered by John Robertson, the Titan who perished in suffocation, And it is only now, at the end of all things, that Robertson's true message reveals itself, clear and as devastatingly sharp as a straight razor. Before he expired, drowning in a pool of coagulated black blood, why did Robertson refrain from demanding vengeance? Why did he not beg Whitmore to drag this truth into the blinding light of the public square? Because that giant possessed an intellect transcendent enough to comprehend a brutal axiom. Vengeance is a luxury reserved solely for those who harbor the delusion of victory. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his civilization was irreversibly dead, and that Whitmore's pathetic species had already been securely locked into a self-destruct mechanism from which there was no possible return. The singular promise Robertson extracted from Whitmore, the sole defiance he desired to hurl directly into the teeth of time, was this: just remember. Just remember that the orthodox narrative actively being preached every single day from the academic pulpits, plastered across the morning dailies, and encased within the museum halls, is absolutely not the truth. It is merely the fabricated edition authored by the survivors, and authored by the most ruthlessly cunning survivors at that. Robertson intended to plant a seed of virulent skepticism deep within Whitmore's psyche, allowing that seed to fracture its shell, violently take root, and rip apart the cocoon of his naivety. Absolute power does not reside in the monopoly of standing armies or fiat currency. True, omnipotent power lies in the ability to dictate the collective memory of an entire species. If they can successfully infect your mind from the moment of your birth with the lie that your ancestors were grunting, primitive savages, and that the cramped, foul-smelling, reinforced concrete society of today is the apex of human evolution, then you will remain hunched over, serving as a docile, obedient worker bee until your dying breath. You will grit your teeth and endure crushing debt, soul-annihilating hours of labor, and the rampant carcinomas bred by a poisoned atmosphere, all while blindly believing. This is simply the toll of progress. I am living in the greatest epoch in human history. This world is not marching forward. It has been violently dragged backward, imprisoned, and downgraded into a cheap, easily manipulated knockoff of reality. Yet so long as humanity possesses no memory of the divine majesty they were robbed of, they will never rise up to reclaim it. The most pitiable slave is the one who gazes adoringly at the iron shackles binding his wrists, entirely convinced they are exquisite jewelry. Samuel Whitmore closed his eyes for the final time in a rotting attic, carrying the scarlet letter of a madman to his grave. But in this specific moment, after having waded through the macabre, soot-stained shadows of 1884 with me, perhaps the ultimate tragedy was not his descent into madness. The most horrific, nauseating tragedy of all is that he accidentally awoke inside a world entirely populated by a herd of sleepwalkers. I implore you to take a long, hard look at the reality we currently inhabit, the reality we so arrogantly thump our chests over: industrial smog, vitality-draining electronic monoliths, microscopic, matchbox apartments commanding exorbitant ransoms, rampant plagues, and a chronic, bone-deep exhaustion that clings parasitically to these fragile, diminutive bodies. Is it possible that this is not the pinnacle of our evolution? Is it possible that the very earth we tread upon daily is nothing much more than an invisible nature reserve? A terrarium, a gargantuan, biological incubator flawlessly engineered for a broken, downsized species that was forcibly stripped of its powerful, statically charged primordial atmosphere. We swell with pride because we can glide our fingers across sheets of smart glass, while right beneath the concrete slabs beneath our beds lies the suffocated, silent bedrock of eternal energy spires forged of red copper and megalithic stone. History has never once been penned by the truly great victors. History is exclusively authored by the survivors. And in the ruthless Darwinian law of degradation, the survivor is rarely the most elite or the most divine. The survivor is merely the most adaptable biological refuse, the smallest, the weakest, and the easiest to domesticate into highly profitable flesh and blood machinery. We are currently chewing on the rotting cud of a magnificent extinguished civilization, entirely deluding ourselves into believing we are feasting at a grand banquet. And so, I leave you with but a single inquiry, one guaranteed to sever your ties to a peaceful slumber tonight. Based on the clandestine cycles of erasure, the reset, that have been meticulously buried in our past. Do you truly believe that the Great Reset was an isolated catastrophe trapped in the 19th century, concluding with the dying breath of the last titan? Or do the horrifying convulsions in our modern climate, the synthetic plagues, and the tyrannical, suffocating grip of contemporary media prove that we are currently living through the embryonic stages of a brand new reset, happening right at this very moment, designed to herd humanity into a cage infinitely smaller and more claustrophobic than the last? Do not take my word for it. Rely on your own primal survival intuition. Leave your theories in the comment section below so we may debate the terrifying possibilities. And if you possess the morbid fortitude to stare unblinking into the blood-soaked mud-caked chasms that history took such great pains to bury alive, hit subscribe.